It's August 2nd, 2026, and there is a 5-mile-long strip of coral rock sitting in the Persian Gulf that has quietly decided the fate of an entire war. Welcome back to the channel, everybody. Good to have you here tonight. We are diving straight into one of the most consequential targets in the entire Iran conflict. A place most people had never even heard of 18 months ago, and now it might be the single most important square mile of real estate on the planet. Kharg Island. So let's set the stage here, because if you don't understand what Kharg Island actually is, none of the last few months of strikes, threats, and blockade drama makes any sense. Kharg Island sits about 20 miles off the Iranian coast in the Persian Gulf. It's tiny, roughly 8 kilometers long, maybe half that wide. Basically a glorified sandbar with some petrochemical infrastructure bolted onto it. But here's the number that matters. Somewhere around 90% of Iran's crude oil exports flow through that island. 90%, not 40, not 60, 90. Every barrel of oil that keeps the Iranian regime funded, every dollar that pays for the IRGC's missile program, every rial that trickles down to keep the Ayatollah's enforcers in boots and bullets, almost all of it gets loaded onto tankers right there on Kharg. So when people ask why the United States keeps circling back to this one island over and over again instead of just carpet bombing the whole country, this is why. You don't need to occupy a nation of 90 million people to bring it to its knees. You just need to choke the one artery that's keeping the whole body alive. And that's exactly what's been happening. Let's rewind a little bit, because the Kharg Island story didn't start yesterday. It's been building for months. Back in March, the US carried out its first major raid on the island, hitting more than 90 separate military sites while very deliberately avoiding the oil and gas infrastructure itself. Think about that for a second. The Pentagon had the ability to turn Kharg's terminals into a smoking crater right then and there, and they chose not to. President Trump came out afterward and said American forces had destroyed military targets there, and he made a point of saying the actual oil facilities were left standing. Why would you do that? Because oil markets are global. Take Kharg's exports fully offline overnight, and you're not just hurting Iran, you're spiking prices at the pump in Ohio and Texas and everywhere else. So the strategy from the beginning has been surgical. Hit the air defenses, hit the radar sites, hit the military garrisons protecting the island, and leave the pipelines and storage tanks standing as leverage, as a threat that's always hanging over Tehran's head like a guillotine that just hasn't dropped yet. Then, in April, we got round 2. New reports came out, this time through Axios, citing a senior U.S. official, confirming another wave of strikes on military targets across the island. Again, the pattern held. Hit the defenses, leave the oil. It's almost like watching someone slowly turn a dial instead of flipping a switch, and that's intentional. This is escalation management. You want Iran to feel the squeeze tightening every few weeks without giving them the one thing that would make them feel like they have nothing left to lose. Because a regime with nothing left to lose is a genuinely dangerous regime. A regime that still has something on the table, something they're desperate to protect, is a regime you can actually negotiate with, or at least pressure into behaving. Now here's where it gets interesting, and where a lot of confusion started creeping into the public conversation. At one point, CENTCOM actually came out and denied that a strike on Kharg Island had taken place, directly contradicting earlier reporting, and even contradicting statements that had come from the White House itself. Now, is that because operational security demanded a denial while assessments were still being finalized? Possibly. Is it because there's a genuine fog of war happening where multiple agencies are getting slightly different pictures of the same target set? Also possible. I'm not going to sit here and tell you I know for certain which strikes were confirmed and which were walked back, because frankly, the information coming out of this theater changes by the hour, and half of what's floating around social media is edited, mislabeled, or flat out fabricated. What I can tell you is the pattern of behavior. Kharg Island keeps getting hit, whether it's officially confirmed in real time or not, and Iran keeps insisting their oil operations are running normal. And every single time, independent satellite imagery tells a very different story than the one coming out of Tehran's state media. Which brings us to the psychological war being fought over this island, because that's honestly just as interesting as the physical one. Every time Kharg gets struck, Iranian state-affiliated outlets go into overdrive trying to convince their own population, and frankly the rest of the world, that nothing happened. We've seen reports out of Mer News claiming the maritime infrastructure suffered little to no damage, and that operations continued as normal. Meanwhile, you've got satellite imagery companies putting out before and after shots that tell a very different story. This is the same regime that told its own people the Strait of Hormuz was fully closed to international shipping, while thousands of commercial vessels were sailing right through it during that exact same window. So when Tehran says Kharg Island is fine, I'd treat that with about the same level of trust you'd give a car salesman telling you the transmission that's making that grinding noise is actually a brand new feature. Let's talk about why the Trump administration has been so fixated on this specific target, because there's a strategic logic here that goes beyond just wanting to hurt Iran's economy in a generic sense. Back in June, Trump directly threatened to hit Iran, quote, very hard, and to seize Iran's energy base on Kharg Island as part of that effort. Seize. Not destroy, seize. That's a different verb entirely, and it tells you something about the ambition here. There have been reports, multiple outlets have run with this, that the administration has at least explored the idea of a marine operation to physically take control of the island. Now, would that actually happen? Occupying a foreign island in the middle of a hostile theater is an entirely different level of commitment than a bombing run. You're talking about holding ground, defending a perimeter, supplying a garrison that's sitting 20 miles off the coast of a country that still has drone swarms and fast attack boats and coastal defense missiles scattered around. That's not a decision you make lightly. But even the fact that it's being floated publicly, even the fact that Trump himself brought it up on the sidelines of a NATO summit, tells you Kharg Island isn't just a bombing target anymore in the minds of some planners. It's being treated as a strategic prize. If you control the island that processes 90% of a nation's oil exports, you don't just weaken that regime, you effectively hold the valve on their entire economy in your own hand. And Iran knows this. That's why we've seen reports of the regime laying traps and moving additional military personnel and air defense systems onto Kharg specifically in anticipation of exactly this kind of operation. Iran's parliament speaker made comments earlier this year about enemies preparing to occupy one of the country's islands without directly naming which one. But come on, everybody in that room knew exactly which island he was talking about. When your own government officials are dancing around naming the target because saying it out loud makes the threat feel more real, that tells you everything about how seriously Tehran is taking this. Let's get into the physical picture of what's actually out there, because Kharg isn't just some abstract pin on a map. It's a genuinely built-up piece of energy infrastructure. You've got the Falat Continental Oil Company facilities, which alone can move something in the range of 500,000 barrels of crude a day. You've got the Kharg petrochemical operations. You've got pipeline networks running underneath the Gulf connecting the island back to Iran's major onshore oil fields. This isn't some improvised smuggling operation. This is decades of infrastructure investment, built specifically because Kharg's deep water access lets massive tankers dock and load without needing to navigate the shallower waters closer to the mainland. It's engineering built for exactly one purpose, moving as much oil as physically possible, as fast as possible, out to the rest of the world. And that's exactly why it became such an obvious pressure point the moment this conflict kicked into a higher gear. Now here's something a lot of people don't realize. This isn't even the first time in modern history that Kharg Island has been on the receiving end of a sustained bombing campaign. Back in the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, Saddam Hussein's forces repeatedly targeted the island specifically because Iraqi planners understood exactly what American planners understand now, that you cripple a petrostate by going after the export terminal, not by trying to grind through their entire standing army one unit at a time. History has a funny way of repeating itself in the Gulf, and Kharg Island keeps ending up right back in the crosshairs because geography never changes even when the political alliances around it do. Let's shift over to what's been happening with the broader blockade. Because Kharg Island doesn't exist in a vacuum, it's tied directly into the fight over the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has repeatedly claimed they've effectively closed the strait to international shipping, and every single time, that claim gets debunked within about 24 hours. U.S. Central Command has been documenting this in real time, redirecting, disabling, and boarding vessels attempting to run the blockade in violation of the rules that have been set, while simultaneously letting humanitarian shipments through. At one point, CENTCOM had processed somewhere around 1,000 vessels through the strait over the preceding months, a fraction of pre-conflict traffic, sure, but still very much proof that the waterway remains open and that Iran does not, in fact, own an international shipping lane just because they'd like everyone to believe they do. We even saw an unladen oil tanker, flagged out of Curaçao, get struck and disabled while it was trying to make its way toward Kharg Island in violation of that blockade after ignoring multiple warnings. That's not an accident, that's enforcement, and it's a pretty clear signal that anyone trying to keep Kharg's export pipeline flowing under the table is going to get caught doing it. Here's the thing that makes this entire situation so uniquely dangerous, and I want you to really sit with this for a second. Oil is fungible, but leverage isn't. Every time the United States hits military targets around Kharg while sparing the actual oil infrastructure, they're sending a message that reads less like an ultimatum and more like a countdown clock. Trump himself has said as much publicly, warning that Iran's oil infrastructure would be the next target if Tehran keeps escalating and keeps refusing to open the strait on its own terms. That's the entire game right there. It's not really about denying Iran oil revenue permanently, at least not yet. It's about using the threat of denying that revenue as the single biggest bargaining chip on the table. You take away someone's electricity a little bit at a time, flickering the lights, and eventually they come to the table to stop the flickering before you cut the whole grid. Let's take a quick detour and talk about why Kharg specifically became the choke point instead of, say, one of the other export terminals scattered around Iran's coastline, because that's actually a really important piece of this puzzle. Iran does have other smaller export facilities, places like Kharg Island and a handful of onshore terminals, but none of them come close to matching Kharg's throughput capacity. The deepwater access alone is a massive factor here. Supertankers, the really massive, very large crude carriers that can haul 2 million barrels in a single trip, need serious draft depth to dock and load safely, and Kharg was specifically engineered decades ago with that kind of vessel in mind. You can't just redirect that volume to a shallower port down the coast and expect the same throughput. The physics of moving that much oil simply doesn't allow for an easy workaround. So when planners identified Kharg as the priority target, it wasn't some arbitrary decision. It was the logical output of understanding exactly how Iran's entire export architecture is built. Cut the head off this one snake and the rest of the body genuinely struggles to compensate, no matter how many smaller terminals Iran tries to lean on instead. There's also a comparison worth making here to other global oil choke points, because Kharg Island fits into a much bigger pattern of how modern conflicts increasingly revolve around a handful of geographic pinch points. The Strait of Hormuz itself is the most obvious example, with a significant share of the entire world's oil supply passing through it on any given day. But Kharg represents something slightly different. It's not a shipping lane that multiple nations depend on. It's a single point of failure that belongs entirely to one country's economy. That actually makes it, in some ways, an even more attractive target from a pure military logic standpoint, because degrading it doesn't require the same level of international coordination and diplomatic sensitivity that comes with threatening to close an international waterway used by dozens of nations. It's surgical in a way that a straight closure never could be. Let's talk about how Iran has been responding to all of this, because the rhetoric out of Tehran has followed a pretty predictable script at this point. Officials come out, accuse the United States and its allies of escalating a conflict that Iran itself keeps reigniting through proxy attacks and straight threats, and then issue vague warnings about retaliation against, quote, any country serving as a shield for American aggression. It's honestly almost comedic at this point, watching a regime that's been launching drone attacks on Gulf neighbors and threatening to mine an international waterway turn around and accuse everyone else of being the aggressor. It's the geopolitical equivalent of someone starting a bar fight, getting knocked out, and then telling the bartender they were the real victim the whole time. And look, we've seen this exact playbook before with other flashpoints in this conflict, whether it's fake footage circulating online claiming to show massive retaliatory strikes that turn out to be either recycled old footage or in some cases outright AI-generated content, or officials making grand claims about capturing special forces personnel that never actually get substantiated with anything resembling real evidence. I'd encourage everybody watching this to just apply a healthy dose of skepticism to anything claiming to be dramatic new footage out of this theater, because the information war happening around Kharg Island and the broader Gulf conflict is arguably just as intense as the kinetic one. Verify before you share, and if something looks a little too perfectly cinematic, there's a decent chance it's exactly that, cinematic and not real. So where does this actually leave things strategically? Let's zoom all the way out for a second and think about the bigger picture here, because I think this is where the real four-dimensional chess is happening. Iran's entire economic survival strategy for the last several decades has hinged on being able to move oil out through Kharg, regardless of sanctions, regardless of diplomatic isolation, regardless of pretty much anything the West has thrown at them. They've built an entire shadow fleet system specifically to keep that revenue flowing even under maximum pressure sanctions regimes. Kharg Island is the one choke point that shadow fleet cannot route around, because it's not a sanctions loophole problem, it's a physical infrastructure problem. You cannot smuggle 90% of a nation's oil exports through back channels. The volume simply doesn't work that way, which means as long as Kharg remains a viable, functioning export hub, Iran has a lifeline. And as long as the United States keeps demonstrating the willingness and the capability to strike it whenever they choose, that lifeline effectively operates on borrowed time, dependent entirely on Washington's patience. It's also worth understanding just how sophisticated Iran's workaround network has become over the years, because it didn't develop overnight. It's the product of decades of sanctions pressure, forcing the regime to get creative. The shadow fleet operates through a maze of ship-to-ship transfers out in open water, flag switching, transponder spoofing, where a vessel makes its tracking signal say it's somewhere it isn't, and layers of shell companies designed specifically to obscure who actually owns a given tanker and where its cargo originated. It's genuinely impressive from a logistics standpoint, in a purely technical sense, how much effort has gone into keeping that oil moving despite years of sanctions regimes trying to choke it off. But here's the thing, all of that sophistication depends entirely on having a functioning loading point to begin with. You can disguise a tanker's identity all day long, but you still need somewhere physical to fill it up. And that keeps bringing everything back to the same island, over and over again, no matter how many shell companies get layered on top of the transaction. This is why I think the administration has been so deliberate about not fully destroying the oil infrastructure yet, even while hitting the military targets protecting it over and over again. It's not mercy, let's be very clear about that, it's leverage management. Destroy the oil terminals completely and you've removed your best bargaining chip in one move. You've guaranteed a genuinely desperate regime with nothing left to lose sitting on a stockpile of ballistic missiles. Keep threatening it instead. Keep circling it. Keep hitting everything around it while leaving the actual prize dangling just out of reach. And you maintain maximum pressure without forcing the worst-case scenario. It's a razor-thin line to walk, and honestly, it's impressive from a pure strategy standpoint, even if you set aside how you feel about the broader conflict itself. But here's the risk, and it's a real one. Leverage only works as long as the other side believes you're actually willing to pull the trigger eventually. If Iran calls the bluff, if they conclude the United States will never actually go all the way and level the oil terminals because of the global economic fallout that would follow, then the threat loses its teeth completely. And that's exactly why we keep seeing these periodic strikes on the military infrastructure around Kharg. Every single one of them is a reminder, a proof of capability, a way of saying, we are still here, we can still reach you. And the next step is always on the table. It's less about the immediate tactical damage from any one individual raid, and more about maintaining the credibility of the threat itself. Let's talk for a second about what a full-scale strike on the oil infrastructure would actually mean if it ever happened, because the ripple effects would be massive and immediate. You're talking about knocking out a facility that handles crude flows in the range of hundreds of thousands of barrels a day at minimum. Global oil markets do not like uncertainty, and they especially do not like supply shocks out of the Persian Gulf, a region that already accounts for a massive percentage of the world's proven reserves and shipping lanes. Prices at the pump would move, and they'd move fast. And that's exactly the kind of economic and political blowback that makes Washington think twice before pulling that particular trigger, even with a hostile regime sitting on the other end of it. It's a genuinely difficult balancing act between maximum pressure on Tehran and minimum disruption to the global economy, and honestly, I don't think there's a clean answer to how you thread that needle perfectly. Let's also touch on how Iran's Gulf neighbors are reading this whole situation, because their reaction tells you a lot about how seriously the region takes the Kharg Island pressure campaign. Countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE have their own oil infrastructure sitting relatively close by, and they've been on heightened alert throughout this entire stretch, watching closely for any sign that Iran might try to lash out at regional targets if Kharg keeps taking hits. We've seen warnings issued by Iranian military commands specifically naming ports, docks, and facilities linked to American operations as potential targets for retaliation, which is exactly the kind of statement that puts every country hosting U.S. assets on edge. Debris from intercepted projectiles has already struck buildings in Dubai, thankfully without serious injury, but it's a pretty clear reminder that when a conflict like this escalates around a single choke point, the shockwaves don't stay contained to just the two primary combatants. Everybody sitting around that Gulf coastline has skin in this game, whether they asked for it or not. And that regional anxiety is part of why there's been such a coordinated push, quietly in some cases and more publicly in others, to keep Gulf neighbors informed and aligned as this pressure campaign around Kharg Island continues to unfold. Now let's bring it back to what this means for the people actually flying these missions and running these operations. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just abstract strategy playing out on a whiteboard somewhere in the Pentagon. It's real air crews, real sailors on that blockade line, real analysts poring over satellite imagery, trying to figure out what actually got hit and what didn't. Every single raid on Kharg Island requires threading through Iran's remaining air defense network, degraded as it may be after months of conflict, but not non-existent. Every single blockade enforcement action out on the water means young sailors making split-second calls about which vessels are legitimate humanitarian shipments and which ones are trying to quietly run Iranian crude out the back door. This is a grinding, methodical, unglamorous kind of warfare, in a lot of ways. Not the kind of single dramatic strike package that makes for a flashy headline, but the kind of sustained pressure campaign that actually wins wars of attrition over time. And I think that's honestly the most important thing to understand about the entire Kharg Island situation if you're trying to predict where this goes next. This isn't building toward one single knockout blow. It's a slow strangulation, a campaign of repeated pressure designed to make the cost of continuing this conflict progressively higher for Tehran with every single week that passes, without ever crossing the line into the kind of catastrophic economic disruption that would destabilize energy markets worldwide. Every strike, every blockade interdiction, every warning issued to the shadow fleet, it's all part of the same broader arithmetic. and that arithmetic is designed to eventually force a choice on the Iranian regime that they simply cannot keep avoiding forever. So what happens next? Honestly, that's the question everybody watching this wants answered, and I'll be straight with you. I don't think anybody outside a very small circle of decision makers actually knows for certain. Does the administration eventually decide the leverage strategy has run its course and go after the oil infrastructure directly? Does Iran finally blink and agree to terms that get them out from under the blockade in exchange for real concessions on their nuclear and missile programs? Does this just continue as a slow burn for months longer? Strikes and denials and counterstrikes, with Kharg Island as the recurring backdrop for the whole thing? I genuinely think all three of those outcomes remain on the table right now. And which one we get probably depends less on any single military decision and more on how much economic pain the Iranian regime is actually willing to absorb before their own internal stability starts to crack. And that internal stability piece matters more than people give it credit for. A regime funding its military and its security apparatus off oil revenue that keeps getting squeezed tighter every month is a regime that eventually has to make hard choices about where the money goes. Do you keep the IRGC fully funded? Do you keep subsidizing fuel and food domestically to keep your own population from turning on you? Every dollar denied at Kharg Island is a dollar that has to come from somewhere else, and there's only so many places left to pull from before something has to give. All right, let me know down in the comments what you think happens next. Do you think we see a direct strike on the oil terminals themselves in the coming weeks, or do you think this leverage campaign keeps grinding along exactly the way it has been? I'd genuinely love to hear your take on this, because there are strong arguments on both sides, and I don't think there's an obvious right answer here. If you found this breakdown useful, drop a like on your way out. It genuinely helps push this kind of coverage in front of more people who are trying to actually understand what's happening in the Gulf instead of just scrolling past another confusing headline. And if you know somebody who's been asking you what the deal is with all this Iran oil stuff, go ahead and send this their way. It'll save you the trouble of explaining the whole thing yourself. One more thing worth touching on before we wrap up, because I think it gets lost in a lot of the day-to-day headline chasing. There's a temptation, especially online, to reduce all of this down to a single dramatic moment. A headline that says the terminal is destroyed or the war is over, and reality almost never works that cleanly. Wars fought over economic choke points tend to resolve gradually through accumulated pressure rather than one decisive strike. And Kharg Island fits that pattern perfectly. Every raid adds a little more weight to the scale, every blockade interdiction removes a little more breathing room from Tehran's economy, and eventually, those small increments add up to something that forces a real decision, even if no single event looks like the finish line in the moment it happens. That's a hard narrative to sell in a world of instant headlines and 30-second clips, but it's the honest one. And I'd rather give you the honest picture than a dramatic one that doesn't hold up a week later. Kharg Island is a perfect case study in how modern warfare against a nation-state increasingly runs through economic infrastructure rather than pure military force on force engagements. You don't need to defeat Iran's entire standing army in the field to bring meaningful pressure on the regime. You need to identify the single node that everything else depends on, and you apply pressure there, patiently, repeatedly, and with just enough restraint to avoid triggering a global economic crisis in the process. That's a fundamentally different kind of warfare than what most people picture when they think about a shooting war, and it's honestly one of the more fascinating aspects of how this entire conflict has unfolded. It's less about tanks rolling across a border and more about a very calculated economic siege, backed up by just enough kinetic force to make sure everyone involved understands the threat is credible. And if you're wondering how you'd even track something like this going forward, honestly, the best approach is just watching for the pattern rather than chasing every single headline as it breaks. Watch for new satellite imagery releases, watch for CENTCOM statements versus Iranian state media claims, and watch that gap between the two, because that gap is usually where the real story is hiding. Watch for any language shift out of the White House around whether the oil infrastructure itself becomes fair game, because that single change in wording would be the clearest signal yet that the leverage phase of this campaign is winding down. And watch what happens to global oil prices in the days following any confirmed strike, because markets have a way of pricing in information faster than official statements ever will. We'll obviously keep tracking this one closely, because Kharg Island isn't going away as a flashpoint anytime soon, not while it's still processing the overwhelming majority of Iran's oil exports, and not while it remains the single most effective pressure point available to force real concessions out of Tehran. Every satellite pass, every new strike report, every denial and counter-denial coming out of CENTCOM and Iranian state media, it's all part of the same ongoing story, and I think we're going to look back on this island a few years from now as one of the defining flashpoints of the entire conflict, right up there with the Strait itself. Thanks so much for hanging out and going through all of this with me tonight. If you're new here, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown, because this situation is moving fast, and there's a real chance we get major developments out of Kharg Island in the very near future. Appreciate every single one of you for watching, for engaging, for actually caring about understanding what's happening in the world instead of just skimming a headline and moving on. And that matters more than you probably realize. Take care of yourselves out there. Go do something good for your body today, even something small. Take a walk, drink some water, step away from the screen for a bit, and I will see you in the next one.